Okay, so now we're moving into the era where a lot of us were born into. So this is very recent history, and so we're just going to kind of take a bird's eye view from the 1980s to the current era. Um, and so many historians are calling this the neoliberal era. It starts with the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Some might say it begins already back under Nixon and Kissinger. That's why I dated it as 1970s. But regardless, um, what this represents is the change from kind of big state liberalism of like the New Deal and the great LBJ Great Society into this era of conservatism with Ronald Reagan. And let's explain what happens with that. All right. Well, the Reagan years basically, it's interesting about these presidencies is how often the decades are defined by the president. So 1980s is basically 8 years of Reagan, and then his vice president George Bush closes it out, but and goes into the 90s. But you think the 1990s are really kind of considered the Clinton years, and then in the 2000s, again, the other Bush. So Reagan is president from the 1980s. He's an older man, former actor, and very staunchly a Cold War, very committed Cold War warrior. He is intensely anti-communist. His background as a governor of California illustrated that, and he's also really kind of the president that brings in the religious right into national politics. So the moral majority really backs up the Reagan presidency, right? Because Ford, Nixon really had not much connection to this religious right. So it's Reagan that brings them in. In a lot of ways, they haven't really left national politics ever since. However, with Reagan, he also got the so-called Reagan Democrats. These are kind of the moderate Democrats who were tired of kind of the big state spending and the economic disaster of the Carter administration with stagflation, but also even the loss of morale with the Iranian hostages from the U.S. embassy in Iran. So interesting fact that when on Reagan's inaugural day, the Ayatollah Khomeini had freed the American hostages because he wasn't going to free them until Carter was out of office. And the reason for that is Carter was seen as palling up with the Shah, who was deposed from Iran. So, yeah, so, and there is a sense that Reagan was going to be a hardliner on things like national defense. And, I mean, he really kind of took it to uh, publicly took it to communism and anything that's kind of smelled. And this is going to have disaster for Latin America with ramping up the Contra wars against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, but even assisting the military junta in El Salvador, which was very violent and kind of indiscriminately violent in some ways. So basically, it was kind of if you're for us, against us, kind of if you're not for us, you're against us, kind of thing when it came to American um, foreign policy. And this is a big shift from like Nixon's détente with China and the USSR. So trying to push the end of the Cold War and seeing the USSR as an evil empire, he puts a lot of money into building up national defense, while at the same time cutting spending on domestic affairs. So this is the famous tax cuts that he did. This is also nicknamed Reaganomics. So this idea of like doing tax cuts or supply side economics, so that more of the top people, top wage earners, or people who make more money, have more are being taxed less, and that there's supposed to be this trickle down of of money that goes down to the lower classes. Now, this kind of is basically conservative economics even to this day. George W. Bush would do a similar policy, but in a lot of ways, this is what I meant. But the neoliberalism, this is significant cuts in the international politics, national welfare, and there is a big attack against the welfare state with Reagan. That's kind of like his claim to fame, that and being very hard line on the Cold War. I mean, he's so hardline. He actually proposed this idea of having these like satellites that would like shoot down missiles if they were coming towards the U.S. and kind of nicknamed this Star Wars campaign. Um, Eventually, the USSR is kind of crumbling internally. The war in Afghanistan for Russia is not going well. It's actually nicknamed their Vietnam, and so there is a new leader of Russia, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Reagan famously would meet with him, and they would sign these treaties. So, as hard line as Reagan was, at his second term, he really does is famous for meeting with Gorbachev and trying to seek a peaceful resolution between the antagonism between U.S. and the USSR. Reagan doesn't really isn't very much involved in domestic policies. His wife Nancy famously starts up the Dare campaign, saying no to drugs and all that stuff. Um, I remember as a kid watching all those commercials, between cartoons. And also, the AIDS crisis begins under Reagan, and famously, Reagan doesn't do much about it. Um, there is that. His second term was also riddled with the Iran-Contra scandal. So what was so crazy with this, as hardline as Reagan was about Iran and Russia and communism, what was happening was um, Congress would not allow the president to aid countries in Latin America, specifically the Contras in Nicaragua. And so people under him were selling weapons to Iran, and this is going against his own policy, and taking that money to fund the war against the Sandinistas, the communists in Nicaragua. So this comes out, it's actually foreign press that exposes this, and potentially Reagan might be impeached, or who knows? That's kind of the feeling in in the national media, like what is going to bring down the president, like it did Nixon. It doesn't. Reagan is actually nicknamed the Teflon president because it seems no negative press really hurts his presidency, and he goes down as a very popular president. At least during the 1980s, so popular that his VP George Bush will win in 1988, and he'll be president for one term. Now listen carefully here. It's under Bush that the Cold War ends. Berlin Wall falls in 1989, and the Soviet Union crumbles beginning of 1992. So he actually oversees the end of the Cold War, and in fact, there was the first Gulf War against Iraq that also happened under George Bush, and that's when Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. So a coalition of forces basically pushes the Iraqis out, and so George Bush is mostly known for his foreign policy issues. But since the Cold War is over and the mood in the United States is that you don't really need a foreign policy president, Bush will lose his reelection campaign against Bill Clinton. Now, there's theories about what this America is supposed to look like after the Cold War is over, and I think there's some very important theories that kind of bled into our age. One is Edward Said's Orientalism, where he says that the way that the West, Western Europe and the United States looks at the Middle East is this kind of Orientalist lens, and that it's a kind of a negative, pejorative view or a weakened view of the Middle East, and kind of presents that kind of European saviorism about the Orient, seeing Asia, Middle East as like backwards, and that modern West has to go in and kind of fix them. So this will have pretty much very dangerous repercussions as we move into the 90s and the 2000s. Another theorist, Francis Fukuyama, thought that with the end of the Cold War, communism was over and democracy would rule over the earth. And so there's a lot of optimism in the 1990s that democracy was just going to like spread throughout the world. Obviously, that has kind of happened, but did not happen. If you think about like the age of terrorism that we're living in today, and the heightened sense of populist rulers across the globe. So it doesn't seem very democratic. But that was the 90s. It's really, really optimistic that democracy would win. And then a more kind of negative view, but I think it also kind of see it in today, is Samuel Huntington's thesis of the clash of civilizations. So he was less triumphal after the Cold War. He instead thought that the United States would have to deal with massive Latin American immigration and the problems that came with that, quote unquote, his what he called problems, and also antagonism towards China and the Middle East. So if you think about that, that's literally American politics today. So I would say, since especially the Bush administration, but a little bit even Clinton administration, it kind of picked up that playbook, and I would say the same thing goes really in spades with the Trump administration. I mean, literally, that's like their playbook. Clinton presidency is known. He's a younger guy. Again, as I mentioned, kind of seen as like, hey, the post Cold War president. But Clinton actually follows through with a lot of Reagan policies. Same thing with even Obama to some extent. And what I mean by that is it's under Clinton that the welfare reform laws are made, things like the three strikes law, which leads to the overcrowding of prisons. It's also NAFTA, which has been disastrous for Mexico and the United States to some extent for jobs, was signed under him. So these are both very kind of what you would call almost Republican policies that he signed in. But that's kind of the Clinton playbook, was to be more Republican than the Republicans and yet still be kind of a liberal Democrat. So I think that, Clinton kind of represents how the Democratic Party has moved away from that 60s liberalism into more of a moderate liberalism, shadowed by the Reagan presidency, since Reagan was so popular. Clinton also inherited what is known as the Silicon Valley boom, right? This is the age the computers are now becoming a staple of global society, specifically American society, and so he's inheriting what that does to the economy. What ruins his presidency is obviously his sexual scandal. He is caught messing around with an intern and lying about it, and basically the second term of his presidency is just riddled with this controversy. Now, there's no surprise anybody knew him, because when he was being running for president in the first place, he was already tagged as being someone who was not faithful to his wife. Finally, the other thing where Clinton seemed to drop the ball was that for all the democracy wins in the 1990s, as listed here, there are a number of terrorist attacks that hit both in the domestic U.S. but also across the globe, and that kind of highlights the move towards 21st century, and you move into the Bush presidency, Obama presidency, where most of you have been born. This is known as the age of terrorism, where terrorism is kind of front and center in national policies. And so Bush, ran as a compassionate conservative, so very kind of Reagan policies, but with a smiley face, somebody who's going to try to be somewhat liberal, at least on the outside. But when 9/11 hit, basically he put all his energy into fighting this war on terror, and kind of the negative consequences that came from that, like the famous Abu Ghraib prison, where American soldiers were mistreating Muslim prisoners. And then after the market crash, Obama became president, and There's not really much on Obama for the test, so it just listed a few things there. I think this stuff is still very close to our time to really call it history anyway.